Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to make an elegant satin blouse with a sash to tie it up at the waist, and I'm super excited to show you this project. I already made a mock-up that you can see right here. So this is my first mock-up that I did after I put together the pattern, and I have a few things to say about this one. So all in all, it looks already pretty promising if you ask me, but of course there are a few things that I want to change, such as the broad shoulders. Although I think looks really cool and sophisticated and elegant on myself. I also put it on myself to see how it looks worn. It is just a tiny bit too wide, so I took in the pattern by 1.5 centimeters up here in the shoulder area. I also made the collar a tiny bit smaller, so just the width of the button tape I just took out in the whole circumference of the neck, and I shortened the pattern underneath the sash, and it's just too long, and I just made the sleeves a tiny bit smaller. That is basically all of the changes that I did. This pattern calls for 1.5 centimeter thick shoulder pads. If you do not wish to make shoulder pads, there is an easy way to just get rid of them. I am going to show you that before we start. So this is my back piece right here. Just going to show you at the back piece. It is exactly the same at the front. You have to do both of them, otherwise the pattern just won't work anymore. So this is the shoulder seam right here. It also says shoulder seam for shoulder pad of 1.5 centimeter thickness. That means basically that I put in 1.5 centimeter thickness in height right here at the arm cutout. So it's just a tiny bit higher than a normal pattern without the shoulder pads. If you don't want to have the shoulder pads, it's an easy fix. You just measure down here 1.5 centimeters and draw a line from the neck shoulder point right here down to the new shoulder pad. Can't really see it. There you go. And then you cut off this part right here, and this line here is your new shoulder line. You do the same on the front piece, and that's already it. Since the sleeve is gathered, there is no need to take out any volume, as it really doesn't matter. You just have a tiny bit more puff because you're missing 3 centimeters in circumference of the arm, so like armhole width. If you wish to also take that out, just slash it in half and close it up at the shoulder point by 3 centimeters, and you should be fine. So that's all. I made a button tape that hides the buttons basically, which means that you have 2 different button tapes on the right or left side. That just looks like this. So you have a big one right here with like 4 panels, and you have a smaller one with just 2 panels. And the smaller one is going to be the one that sits on your left, so right here, and the big one is going to sit on your right. As usually the female closure is from the left, so that is how these pieces will end up sitting. It really doesn't matter with how the pattern will be placed in the end with like cutting out the pattern piece, and it's just simply a rectangle, and we're going to mark the buttons and button holes after it's put onto the blouse, after it's totally finished. So then we can still change the direction of the pattern piece to mark the buttons. So that's basically all that I did. We have a slit in the cuff, as done a few times before. It's going to be a piped slit, so that is a nice finish there. We're going to have cuffs with button loops instead of buttonholes, so we're going to do the loops ourselves, of course. And apart from that, the sash, of course, but everything else is just how you usually make a blouse. So I'm super excited to share this with you guys, as we're going to attempt a blouse that has as least top stitches as possible, because that's just what I think makes the blouse even more elegant. So we're going to try our best to not have any top stitches, and yeah, let's start the video. I want to start with the collar. So this is a usual shirt collar, as you might have already seen in this video up here. I also made a collar very similar to this one, so the making the process basically stays the same, it's just a different shape. So we have an inner and an outer collar. The inner collar is a tiny bit smaller than the outer collar, as it's sitting on the inside, and the outer collar curves over top of it, so it just needs a tiny bit more fabric. Same goes to the outer and inner collar band. These are corresponding to the, inner collar goes together with the inner collar, outer collar together with the outer collar band. It's as easy as that. So to prep these, I already put interfacing on the pattern pieces right here. A few more pieces need interfacing, but that will all be marked in the pattern and also in the interfacing guide that I'll provide to you with the sewing instructions that you can get with the link down below in my Etsy store. So to start off, I firstly want to iron out the fold in the center back. By the way, I am using a rayon satin with a tiny bit of stretch. This pattern does not need stretch as it is a very voluminous pattern, so that's just something that I had in stock and I really like the color with this design, so that's just what I opted for. Any blouse, or like not even blouse, but like any thinner fashion fabric you can use for this. Obviously a satin is always very, very elegant and will look very good on this pattern. We're going to put right sides of the collar band and the collar itself together by putting this on top of the other piece, and you're going to find notches that have to be matched up. So this right here, oh my god, the satin is not wanting to move at all. This right here is the center back notch. So we're going to put that here. And here you're going to find another notch in the collar band that marks the end of the collar. Keep in mind that on the collar there is seam allowance, like you should have put seam allowance on the collar. In my pattern is no seam allowance, as people use different measuring systems, so either imperial or metric. So I just wanted to give you the option to choose whatever. I'm using metric, so I added 1 centimeter seam allowance, corresponds to 1/2 of an inch seam allowance, I guess. And I'm just matching up, as I said, the notch right here with the stitching line of my collar. So I go 1 centimeter in and then pin this towards the notch. I also match up the shoulder point and just copy the same on the other side, and then also on the inner collar to close the collar band seam right here, just like that. Something that I want to add before you go on and sew this together: only sew from the notch right here, from the center front notch, to the other side, the other center front notch. Don't sew into the seam allowance, as we're going to cut away the seam allowance after we're done sewing this together. So only from this point where I have my needle in right here to this point over on the other side where I also have a needle in. Same goes for the inner collar. We are going to iron all of the seam allowance into the collar band, as that is the piece that needs the most strength. And you might also want to cut into the seam allowance towards the stitching line here. I don't find it's necessary as I have an elastic fabric, but you might find it just lays better if you do so. And we do the same for the inner collar. Just like that. And now we're going to iron the seam allowance of the outer piece towards the inside to prepare it to sew on top of the finished shirt in the very end. That calls for visible stitching lines on the outside though. So it's the easiest way and the easiest method, and I think also the neatest method to manufacture this. But as I said that I want to have as least top stitches as possible, I might want to do it the other way around and try to stitch into the ditch. So that calls for me ironing in the seam allowance of the inner collar band and therefore having visible stitches on the inside but invisible stitches on the outside as I try to stitch into the ditch. So I think I will be doing that. So let's iron up the seam allowance of the collar band, of the inner collar band. And let's also, to prepare for sewing, cut towards the notch here in the center front right here. So let's peel away the collar and expose the collar band and cut towards the stitching line right there at the notch. And let's repeat that on the other side and then also on the outer collar. We want this to be on every piece. And now we can already put the two collars together. We put right sides of the collar together and match up all of the notches. And you're gonna find while sewing that the inner collar, as I already mentioned, is going to be smaller than the outer collar. You want to match up the two collar pieces perfectly though, without having any gaps or whatnot like this. Like you want to match them up like this, as you do with every pattern piece basically, because that is how the collar itself is constructed to be smaller. So you want to align them nevertheless, and that will make it easier for you in the end to iron the collar how it's supposed to get ironed, with the ditch of the seam only being visible on the inner collar side, as there is less fabric basically, so it just folds automatically that way. And we're going to match up the corner here, but we're going to start stitching only at the fold that we ironed into the collar band, because everything here will be needed for putting the collar onto the shirt itself, so that needs to be moving freely. Then we can take out all of the seam allowance here and stitch toward that point. And it's probably also smart to cut towards the stitching line at the collar, as that will make it possible for us to turn the corner easier, as we can also peel out the fabric. Let's actually cut away a tiny bit of fabric right here. And as you can see, it just aligns like this. So it's supposed to be like this, but while sewing, we can pull it like this. So we have a straight line, and we need to touch this point right here where the stitching line is. And then we can continue on to sew the collar pieces together. I will repeat the same here. And once we're done with sewing the pieces together, we're going to cut away more right here to avoid bulge. So this is just for preparation. And be sure to match up the stitching line nicely here, as this point is like very, it's visible in the end. It's going to be visible. And you also want to make sure to sew this curve nicely. So let's do this again. We're going to cut towards the stitching line at the collar and then just cut away a tiny bit of seam allowance. Just like that. And now we can open the seam up like this and sew just over top here, and also match up this seam. And now we can sew from, as I said, the fold at the collar band here all the way over this round piece, over this stitching line right here, while pulling it straight into the corner, over the center back, and down here until the ironing fold. Okay, that is what it looks like. Make sure there is no hole visible in here, that your stitches are close enough to the other stitching line so that this here is sewn together. And now we can start and cut away the corners pretty drastically to about 2 to 3 millimeters right here. Same to the other side. And then I also want to cut away the seam allowance here and just smooth into 1 centimeter again. Same goes to here. We're just going to cut away the seam allowance towards the tip up here to about 5 millimeters. And this is the finished collar. It has no stitching lines at all. Of course, you can customize that however you want. You can add the stitching lines once the collar is put onto the blouse. Don't do it right now, do it afterwards. That is just your choice and your design. I will leave it like that. I will probably add one right here, just to fix the collar and the collar band, like the inner and the outer together. So to have this seam just fixed together, otherwise it's just gonna move and it's not gonna look nice, and the collar will be folded on top of it anyway, so you won't be able to see it. That's why I will be adding one stitching line from here to here to fix it in place. Also, after I am done with putting this onto the blouse. Speaking of putting it onto the blouse, let's grab front and back pieces. So this is my back piece with the fold in the center back. Let's give this a press to take it out so that everything looks neat and tidy. And this is our front. We're going to put right sides of front and back together at the shoulder seam, so up here, right there, and sew together, and then we're gonna do the button tape to be able to put the collar onto the blouse. I am going to do French seams for this, as I don't want to have overlock seams visible on the inside if I'm already putting so much effort into the blouse to have no top stitches. I also want it to look neat and tidy on the inside, so I will be doing French seams. French seams are done by putting wrong sides together and stitching at 5 millimeters right here, and then we're going to cut down the seam allowance to about 2 to 3 millimeters and invert the seam so that the right sides are matching up. Then we're going to top stitch again so that we have like some sort of encasing of the raw seam, and that way on the inside it looks neat and tidy, and on the outside it just looks like a normal seam. That's what I'm going to do. Obviously, if you don't want to do that because it is a lot of effort, like you are sewing effectively twice and also preparing the seam and ironing and so on, you can always just put right sides together and overlock the seam instead. So that's your choice, whatever you feel comfortable with. So let's continue with the button tapes. So the smaller one is pretty straightforward. You just iron the long side in half, and then we're going to iron the seam allowance of one side towards the inside to prepare for later. And then I want to change it up a little bit to what I would usually do, which would just be putting this onto the blouse with the hem still being open and then hemming the blouse completely in one go. I don't want to do that with this piece, as I'm trying to be as elegant as possible, so I'm thinking about just putting right sides together and then closing the hem before I'm hemming the blouse and before I put the button tape onto the front piece. So this will be the one that sits on your left side of the body, and as I did with the collar as well, I want to have the prepared ironed side on the inner side of the blouse. So the non-ironed side will be on the outside. Therefore, I am turning the button tape respectively, and that just shows me that this side on the bottom needs to be closed to hem. So what I do for that is just putting right sides together, and I can then close from the ironing fold, just as I did with the collar as well. From the ironing fold towards the fold here, I can close the seam. Let's just quickly talk about the other side as well, as we're going to do something similar. The other side is a hidden button tape, so there is another layer on top of this usual button tape to hide the buttons once it's closed. So let's think about that as well. We have 4 different notches right here, so I'm just going to iron inwards one side, which should be 4 centimeters. So let's just do this really neat like this, and then we're going to fold it the other way, so like right sides together, which should be 3 centimeters. That's the width of the button tape. And then we're gonna fold the last piece on top here again. So we end up with two button tapes basically on top of each other. And this is going to sit on the right side of your body. So for this, we want to close this hem down here, and closing the hem of a hidden button tape is interesting. And I'm going to show you how to do that. So closing an invisible button tape, I'm not sure what the word is. I have to determine first what my outside is going to be. So for me, it's going to be this side right here. Therefore, I want to have more layers on the outside than I want to have on the inside. So I'm going to grab 3 layers like this that I will be treating as one layer, and then I'm going to unfold the last one, so the one that sits closest to your body on the inside, and just wrap it around like this on top of all the 3 layers, and sewing towards the seam allowance here. So for the other side, we ironed in the seam allowance right here. We probably could have done that as preparation for this as well, but I am just going to stitch up until 1 centimeter before the edge. So I'm going to stitch right up until here and towards the fold right here. And you're gonna find that the single layer right here is a tiny bit too small to cover all 3 of the other layers, as it's just bulkier, even though they are the same length. So I'm just going to pull this underneath the sewing machine so nothing folds and wrinkles up on the inside here, because that will be visible in the end and we don't want that. So that's what I'm going to do here. And as I already mentioned how to do the other tape, I will also be doing that. So let's fold these right sides out. For the single button tape, I can go ahead and cut down the seam allowance like this. To pop out the edge, it's just a tiny bit easier and it just looks nicer. Like this. And for this piece right here, I will be doing the same, and then also try to pop out the edge as neatly as possible. But since this is just a few more layers, it easily pops out, so this should be no problem at all. Now I want to iron the seam so that the ditch of the seam is only visible on the side that lays on the inside or on the facing. You know the drill already. Just like that. And here the same. I also want to prepare this and put the seam allowance towards the inside and give it another press. So that's the single button tape all prepped, and this is the invisible button tape, and we also want to prep the inside by also ironing 1 centimeter up. Probably would have been easier to just do this before we sewed this together, but we can still do it now. And those are the 2 prepped button tapes. Now let's put them onto the front piece. Now, laying the body of the blouse out in front of you basically gives you only one option to put the button tapes onto the front pieces when considering that we want the fold to lay on the inside. So this goes here and this one goes here on this side. We're going to put here at the hem the button tape 1 centimeter upwards, as we already hemmed the button tape to make it look neater. Now we're going to hem the blouse body separately. Later on, once the side seams are together, once the sleeves are in, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the last steps. Just make sure that you place it upwards here onto the stitching line and sew the button tape on both sides onto the front pieces. Button tape is sewn on. Let's put the right side down and iron the seam. So you probably want to cut towards the stitching line here, otherwise you won't be able to fold the seam allowance into the button tape, which is what you want to do. So we're just going to cut into the seam allowance towards the stitching line here and just leave it as is. We're going to deal with that later once we hem the piece, so that now we can put everything inside of the button tape. And down here, we also want this to be inside the button tape. So let's fold it towards the inside here. And now we can fix the inside in place. So we want to sew into the ditch from the outside. That means that we are going to stitch right in to the ditch of this seam here. This seam is this stitching line here. So with our ironed fold, we want to cover that stitching line completely by like 1 millimeter. Be very, very exact with that and just put a pin in to hold it in place, because that's going to ensure that when we stitch from the other side, from the right side, that we're going to catch this button tape here. So this is what the button tape looks like. I already went ahead and put the button holes in, as it's just easier to put them in now rather than when up here the collar will be attached to, and it will be like this. So go ahead and put the button loops in place with the help of your pattern piece. There are the placements marked, and obviously you just want to have them on the lower 2 layers. The upper 2 layers are to be put on top and cover them up basically. So this is what it end up being like. Putting on top right here. We're gonna put buttons at the very end. Doesn't really matter if the collar is on, as you have the same access. Speaking about collar, let's put the collar on as the neckline is complete now. The non-iron side is the outer collar, so that will be the one that will be folded like this. So we're going to put the outer collar onto the wrong side of your blouse. So right side of the collar to the wrong side of your blouse. While matching up all of the notches, it should be fitting just on top here. So as the seam of the neckline is very, very curved, you might find it troublesome to match up the seams. So just stretch them a tiny bit and then you should be able to put them together, no problem. Make sure to match up the shoulder notch in the collar band right there, should match up with the shoulder seam, and the notch here marks the button tape. And now I'm going to sew the collar on from this side to the other side of the button tape. Okay, the collar is on, and now we're going to put the seam allowance that we already ironed over on top of it. I'm just going to cut down the seam allowance here a tiny bit, not all the way, as it's just not as easy to put it under the collar band if it's completely gone. And then I'm just going to fold the collar band right on top of the stitching line, just as I did it with the other seams before as well. So I'm going to sew visibly on top here, and then, as I already said before, I will also add a top stitch here on this side so that the collar bands are together, and this will be covered by the collar, so it should not be visible. I'll do it closely to the edge anyways, just to make it as neat and tidy as possible. The next thing that we're going to do, as we already finished the body of the blouse, are the sleeves. And we have a slit down here in the sleeve pattern, which means that we're also going to use the sleeve slit piping right here. So we are going to prepare the sleeve slit a tiny bit by ironing it in half. And then ironing one side in half again. So now that this is prepped, we can go ahead and put the sleeves right in front of us with the wrong side facing up, because we're going to pin the non-iron side or right sides onto the wrong side of the slit. And the piping pattern is longer than the slit itself, just to have a bit more room, so you don't have to put like edge on edge. It really doesn't matter, we're gonna cut it off later. But basically we're gonna pin the two pieces together. It's probably the best to pin from the right side of the sleeve, because we're gonna sew with 5mm seam allowance. But once we come to the slit part right here, like to the end of the slit, we want the seam allowance to be almost 0, to be like about 1mm, as you can see here, so that we can just straighten out the seams, the slit of the sleeve, and just pin the slit piping right across. And then go to the usual 5mm again, putting like edge to edge on this side here. And now we can sew, while pulling the slit straight, we can sew the piping to the slit, making sure that we catch enough of the sleeve still once we reach the tip here. So you're just going to like catch like the latest point of the fabric basically. You're gonna try to catch that with your machine and then go across here and come back to here. Basically you're staying at 5mm seam allowance everywhere, but the slit just goes more inwards the further you go to the tip, and the piping always has 5mm seam allowance, so you're just going to sew it right across here. And this is what it should end up looking like. As you can see here, I just caught the fabric of my sleeve just by like 1mm. Everything else here is the slip piping seam allowance. This is what it looks like on the inside. So I did not catch any folds or whatsoever. All of this is very flat. And now that that is approved, I can go ahead and fold the seam allowance into the sleeve and then the prepared folds right on top. I'm just gonna put pins in so that I can sew this. Same goes to right here. And then I'm going to sew top stitch the slit right at the open side onto the sleeve. So right here, very closely to the edge of the fold. And now it's time to iron. This is what it looks like. So it looks a bit messy still, but we're going to iron the piping first of all, like right up until the tip of the slit, just to make the piping flat and nice, like this. And then we're going to fold the other side inwards and right on top of the piping, with the slit opening facing towards the back of the sleeve, which is the shorter side. So as you can see here, here's the long side, this is going to be the front, here is a shorter side, this is going to be the back, and the opening needs to face this direction towards the back. And now, with the slit being like this, there's still one thing that we need to do, which is right here at the tip here. We want to add a tiny back tag that is at 45 degrees angle from this corner right down here, just like this. And this is what the slit should end up looking like. My fabric is not really the easiest fabric. It's really hard to make a perfect looking slit. I also have like a tiny fold up here to hide the piping, which is fine as everything here will get ruffled up anyways. So I'm totally fine with how this looks. I actually think this looks better than the other side that I already prepared, but whatever. Let's continue. I will put just a pin here to handle the sleeve better, just so that it doesn't open up all the time, because we can go ahead and prepare the sleeve head, which will be gathered same as the hem right here, but for that we are going to sew the side seams together first, which we're only going to do after we put the sleeve into the body of the blouse, because it's just easier. So let's prepare the sleeve head by stitching into the seam allowance from back notch to front notch twice with your biggest stitch without back tacking, so that you can gather the sleeve head to the size of the sleeve opening on your body of the blouse. Okay, that's it already for today's video. I have to cut this into 2 parts as it's just getting way too long and I don't want you to, have to watch a condensed video. So I decided to go for a 2-parter as this is a video or like a project with a lot of elements together. So let's do everything not stressed out and calmly and so on and so forth and in detail rather than having everything pressed into one video and then maybe overlooking something. So that's what I decided to do. I hope you don't mind. The next part will be up next Sunday. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel to not miss part 2 and obviously every other video that I will upload on my channel. I upload every Sunday, so you can keep an eye out for that and ring the bell so you'll get notified. In the meantime, go check out my Instagram as I am uploading loads of reels all about my projects and tips and tricks that you might be interested in. Link is down in the description below. It's the same handle as here on my YouTube, so check it out and give me a follow there. The pattern will probably be already online. Let's not promise anything. I don't know if it's online yet, but if it is, you'll find a link down in the description below and also in the pinned comment. It will definitely be online by the time of part 2 being published, so go ahead and check that out. And yeah, thank you so much for watching and I'm gonna see you next Sunday. Bye guys!